Okay, I think we'll get started. I want to welcome everyone to Cluster Busters webinar. This evening, we will be discussing clinical trials. We're thrilled that you're joining us as we discuss this important topic. Many people have a lot of questions regarding clinical trials, and we hope to answer a lot of those this evening for you. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. There is a Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A. You can click on that or open it however you'd like and type in your questions. We as panelists will be able to see those questions. And after our presentation, we will address some of those questions with as much time as we have left. I'd like to welcome our panel this evening. I want to thank them all for being here first. He doesn't really need an introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Mr. Robert Wald. He is the executive director and founder of Cluster Busters, and he has been around doing this for more than 20 years. So he knows a little bit about cluster headaches. We're excited to have him here. Next, I'd like to introduce Marcus Banstein. Is it Steen or Stein? I'm really sorry. I should have asked you this earlier.
I say Bernstein.
Bernstein. All right. I'm so sorry I didn't ask sooner. Marcus has a PhD in neuroscience from Uppsala University and has been working with clinical studies for more than a decade. He is currently an international study manager for Lundbeck based in Denmark, but he resides in Sweden. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Last but not least, we have Dr. Mark Burish. Dr. Burish received his MD PhD from Vanderbilt, and then he went on to a residency at UC San Francisco. He also completed a fellowship program there in, I believe it was interventional pain management. Now Dr. Burish is a UCNS certified headache specialist who treats patients with headache diseases and pain, and he also conducts research in Houston. Thank you guys so much for being here. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Burish.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. But thank you everyone for being here. There we go. I really appreciate talking to patients, their families, and their friends. And this topic is really important because it's all about new treatments for cluster headache. So for disclosures, we always start off with letting you know any kind of disclosures that might be an issue. I do get some research support from a local nonprofit here in Houston called the Will Irwin Headache Research Foundation. I'm not a consultant or speaker for anyone. We are going to be talking about things that are not yet FDA approved. That's kind of what you have to do as part of clinical trials. But these things that we're talking about, these study drugs and what they're for, is all research based. For the clinical trial participation, Lundbeck is here. Dr. Benstein is here. This is a Lundbeck sponsored event, and there are currently only 2 treatments being tested in the United States for cluster headache. One is from Lundbeck, the other is vitamin D. I personally, my research group, is helping with both clinical trials. So that's the kind of disclosure here, is that we're actively involved in these clinical trials. We're going to discuss them a bit. I'll remind you right before we discuss them that Lundbeck and myself are part of these trials. And then finally, this is not supposed to be promotional. This is not supposed to be an advertisement for anything. This is more information. That may limit a little bit of what I can say. I can't mention specific names of drugs and things like that because that could be seen as an advertisement. All right, so that's the disclosures. Let's talk a little bit about how this webinar is going to be organized. I'm going to spend about 20 to 30 minutes going over clinical trials, what they are, how you can assess them, how you can participate in them, some of the ongoing clinical trials for cluster headache, and then we'll finish with the Q&A. If you're coming in a little bit late, Eileen had mentioned this, but at the bottom should be a Q&A button, and you can put questions in there, and we will try to get to them as many as we can. All right, so we're going to talk about randomized controlled trials. There are technically lots of different types of trials, but these are considered the gold standard. Almost all major trials now are randomized controlled trials. So here's what a randomized controlled trial is. So patients are randomized to be in different groups, usually just 2 groups. Group 1 would get the intervention, group 2 would get the control, and then we see if there's any difference between the 2 groups. For example, let's use a calcium channel blocker. Verapamil is the one people know the best, but let's use a calcium channel blocker. So group 1 gets a calcium channel blocker, group 2 gets a placebo, like a pill full of sugar. And the difference between the groups for cluster headache is how many headaches you have over the next 3 weeks. So that would be the basics of a randomized controlled trial. So randomized means that people are randomly put into different groups. Basically, you determine which group the patient goes into by the flip of a coin. So why is it randomized? Well, if it's not, there could be biases. So as an example, let's take a hypothetical patient and let's call her Eileen Brewer. So hypothetically, let's say Eileen is the president of a patient-run headache nonprofit and just an overall fantastic person. So she wants to be in a clinical trial that's not randomized. That means that the research team gets to choose whether the fantastic Eileen Brewer gets the intervention or whether she gets the placebo. So you could see how they could start to bias the decisions towards some people, either intentionally or unintentionally. Eileen, sorry to use you as an example, you are a fantastic person. That part wasn't hypothetical. The controlled part means that there's a control group. So why is a control group necessary? Well, episodic cluster headache is a pretty good example. As most of the people here know, episodic cluster headache comes in episodes. You'll have a cycle of headaches for weeks or months, and then the cycle ends for a stretch of time, and then it may come back. So let's say you do a study of a calcium channel blocker for episodic cluster headache without a control group. Some of the patients stop having headaches completely. So is that because of the calcium channel blocker, or is it because their headache cycle stopped on its own? There's no way to know. Now, if you had a control group, you could compare the groups, and that would tell you if the calcium channel blocker was any better than a sugar pill. So that's why we do the control part of the randomized controlled trial. So how does a randomized clinical or randomized controlled trial, which is here in the middle, how does that fit into the bigger picture of clinical research? So let's start at the bottom, and I'll kind of explain those as we go up. So first you have citizen science or case reports. These are specific cases that, or maybe a group of cases that have been reported that maybe this works. You know, maybe I've noticed something new, nobody's really ever reported it before, and I'd like to tell people it works. This is how a lot of research is first discovered. Then there are case control studies. These are when you look at a disease and look backwards. A lot of times this is done for epidemiology. You take a bunch of cluster headaches and look backwards and see how many of them were smokers versus not smokers, and how does that compare to a group of people who don't have cluster headache. But it can go backwards and look at medications. How many people looking backwards found a medicine was helpful. Then there are cohort studies. These studies people kind of in the present and in the future. So you'll take, for example, 100 cluster headache patients and follow them for the next 2 years and see what happens. You get lots of detailed information. You can check in with them over and over again. You can see what other elements might be important. But again, you're not controlling what they do. You just kind of see what happens to them. Then there's the randomized controlled trials, which is what we're talking about. And all of this data is used to inform these 3 top ones. So practice guidelines, an example would be that the American Headache Society comes out and says, here is the list of treatments that we recommend for cluster headache. And they actually did that a few years ago. And they base their data on the randomized controlled trials and cohort studies and things like that. And they give preference to ones with the randomized controlled trials. If you have good randomized controlled trial data, that's going to probably get you a better recommendation. Then there are systematic reviews. These basically take all the randomized clinical controlled trials, put them in one place so that you can get a good picture of everything that's been done for that disease. And then finally, there's a meta-analysis. Those take all the the randomized controlled trials and put them into, kind of pile them together, kind of mash them together into a single study. So they take every patient from a study, let's say that the same drug was tried in 3 different trials. They take all 3 trials, put it all together, and reanalyze that data. So it gives you a kind of a bigger number, a bigger amount of data. And those are considered kind of the top of the line. You've taken all the data that's out there and put it together. But a lot of it, especially the top part, as you can see, is based on randomized controlled trials. Now, within randomized controlled trials, there are different phases, and you may have heard of some of those. Phase 3 are the most typical ones, and those are the last phases you typically need before FDA approval. Phase 0 are laboratory studies of cells and animals. Phase 1 are initial safety studies, usually in healthy controls, so just healthy patients without the disease, to see if the drug being studied has any effects on humans you didn't expect from your animals. Phase 2 are larger safety studies, usually in patients. So for example, they do safety studies in cluster headache patients. And then the phase 3 are the randomized controlled trials to see if the medication or the drug or the device is actually effective. So what you're mainly going to see are phase 3 studies, but you could also participate in phase 1 or phase 2 studies. You can't participate in phase 0 because you're not an animal. Well, you're an animal, but you're not a non-human animal. So that's a little basic. How do you participate in a randomized controlled trial? So a good place to start is on clinicaltrials.gov. And here is their homepage. This is what it looks like. So this is a website that's run by the United States government that serves as a database for both researchers and patients. All clinical trials in the United States are basically required to be posted on clinicaltrials.gov, or it can't be published as a clinical trial. So if you wanted to look at cluster headache and you want to know if there's a study that you might be able to participate in, you want to click up here, like I've done on recruiting and not yet recruiting. If you click on all studies, it'll also show you ones that are completed. You may not be interested in those. You click on the condition you're interested in. So you put in cluster headache. You put in your country. So I'm assuming most people here in the United States. And then you put in your state and your city, and then sometimes the distance you're willing to travel. The city and state, I'll let you know, are not always up to date on every study. So sometimes if you're still curious, you can contact the study. There's a lot of logistics to update the web pages on here. So sometimes they're not always up to date. So if you do all that and you click the search button for cluster headache, I did this a few weeks ago, but you get something that looks like this. So here are all the studies right now that are either recruiting or not yet recruiting. I like to narrow it down a little bit. This is not how I generally like to look at it. So if you're going to do this, I'd recommend that you click over here on the show hide columns and you change a couple of things so you can see a little bit more information. So you click on all the green things and you click off all of these. It'll give you a little bit more on, for example, narrow down the locations and things for you so you can see where they are. But if you do that, you'll see 4. And that, at least as of a few weeks ago, were all the ongoing randomized clinical trials for cluster headache. And we're going to talk about these a little bit. 2 of these aren't actually interventional. So the study type, 2 of them are observational. That means you can also post some observational things. That means it is not a randomized controlled trial. They are doing things more like the case control or the cohort studies where they're watching you. They're just observing you. They're not giving you anything. So that's kind of how you see how you participate. Now that you see the list, how do you assess them? How do you figure out what the study is, who can be in the study, and things like that? So in my opinion, there's 5 things you want to know. First, what is the study design? So like I showed you there, is it interventional where they're trying treatments, or is it observational where they're observing? They aren't giving you anything. They're interested in some aspect of your life. Like, are you a smoker? Was your last medication effective? Things like that. You want to know what the arms and interventions are. So all randomized control trials will have different groups, which they call the arms. And here is what they're going to tell you what the drug is. So it's a calcium channel blocker. It's a CGRP and antibody, something else like that. So you get to see what you're actually getting tested on. Then there's the outcome measures. This is what they're testing. For cluster headache, it's pretty straightforward. If the treatment breaks a headache, like oxygen, what they're going to be testing is pain relief. How much pain relief do you get? If the treatment prevents a headache, like a calcium channel blocker, Then they'd be interested in how many headaches you have over the next few weeks. Then there's eligibility criteria, which you'll have to look for yourself and see if you qualify. Sometimes, for example, they only enroll adults. So if you're a teenager, you couldn't be in it. Sometimes they only enroll episodic cluster headache, or they only enroll chronic cluster headache. So if you're not sure about some of those things, you actually may want to ask your doctor to see if you qualify. And then finally, the contact information and location. So contact information, how do you call them or email them or otherwise get to them? Locations, do they have something in your area? If they need to do something, for example, like a blood draw, and they do it in the clinic, and the closest place is 300 miles away, you may not be able to be in that study. So this is how you'd assess if you want to be kind of in a randomized controlled trial, kind of what the study is like. For just as an aside, if you're looking at a published clinical trial and you want to know, is this a good trial or how it's designed, you would do the same thing in a published clinical trial. So as a second part of the assessment, how do you or how do researchers know whether treatment's actually worth trying? So first, you should know you can't just try anything you want. Researchers can't just start enrolling if they have an idea. Every clinical trial has to be approved by an independent ethics board. So that ethics board is primarily concerned with safety, fairness, and a solid research plan. Second, most cluster headache treatments are based on one of three brain systems that are shown here. Oh, the reference isn't on the slide. So this is from a publication that I wrote back in 2018 in a journal called Continuum. So the first system here is the red one here. This is the pain system for the face, and that involves the nerve to the face, the trigeminal nerve, and certain molecules like calcitonin gene-related peptide or CGRP. So treatments for cluster headache that target this system are things like the triptans, the ergots, capsaicin, and these anti-CGRP monoclonal antibodies. Second is the green system here, the cranial autonomic. This is the system that causes the changes on the face. It makes your eye water, your nose run, your eye get puffy or droopy or turn red. That's the autonomic system. There's a very strong connection between the red and the green. You can activate it by eating a hot chili pepper. If you ever notice about eating something really hot, it makes your eyes water and your nose runs. That's a connection between these two areas. This area uses different molecules like VIP or vasoactive intestinal peptide, and things like oxygen and possibly vagus nerve stimulation may be targeting this system. Finally, there's the hypothalamus. The oxygen and the vagus nerve stimulation here. And then finally, there's the hypothalamus. This controls a lot of regulatory functions like your hormones and your daily rhythms. This may be why clustered patients have headaches at the exact time every day. And some of the preventive treatments like calcium channel blockers, steroids, some bipolar medications that we sometimes use for cluster headache or melatonin, these probably work on the hypothalamus. So most new treatments in clinical trials will probably have a theory that they work on one of these three systems, unless we make new discoveries that show some other areas important. Okay, so I finished talking about what a clinical trial is and how you assess them. So let's get into the details of the clinical trials. So here's a list of the recently finished clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov. That's the US government website. So I broke them down into a few categories. So these are as an abortive, which means they break a headache like oxygen, or as a preventive. Here is phase 1, 2, or 3. And as a reminder, phase 3 are the ones to see if they're effective. That's the last step usually before getting FDA approval. And then the last one is the country. Again, I'm assuming most people here are in the United States, so I put those up at the top, but there may be people in other countries, and so I put some of these other ones down here at the bottom for people who are interested. But eventually, all of this will be published. It doesn't matter where it was done. The studies here, I think there's a couple things important to note. I'm not going to go through every single study, but first, again, the FDA requires a phase 3 study prior to approving it. So the ones that completed phase 3 here are the ones that are most likely to be available to patients soon. It doesn't guarantee it, The studies may have negative results, and it turns out they don't help with cluster headache, or the FDA might not like how they did the study, but these are still the most likely to be available. Second, you'll see here that people are trying a variety of different things for cluster headache. There are some treatments here that I know cluster busters, people on this webinar, wish researchers would have looked into years ago, and hopefully are at least somewhat happy to know that researchers are looking into them now. There may also be some things on here that you may not have even thought of as a possible treatment. The ultimate goal is to find something safe and effective. So it's just nice to have lots of different trials for lots of possible options. All right, here's the list of active studies. These have not completed yet. These are currently enrolling patients. Again, I'm assuming most people here are in the United States, so I'm going to focus mainly on these top two. But again, if you're in a different country, these may be things that you're interested in trying, and you can look on clinicaltrials.gov and find the contact information and talk to the teams or talk to your regular physician, see if these are good for you. So again, just to mention before I kind of go into these any deeper, Lundbeck is sponsoring this study. I am participating in both of the two studies that I'm going to be talking about here. You can take that as you will. You can take it as a positive or negative, but either way, I'm pretty familiar with these studies, so I can talk about these two at the top in fairly good detail. So here's the first study on an anti-CGRP monoclonal antibody for cluster headache. It was broken into two different studies, one called Alleviate, and this is for episodic cluster headache, and that's a randomized control trial. One is called Chronicle, and that's for chronic cluster headache, and that's an open label trial, which means there is no control group, and all the study participants get the anti-CGRP monoclonal antibody for 1 year. So why two different studies? The short answer is you'd have to ask the company, but in my personal opinion, it's because there was a similar medication, another anti-CGRP monoclonal antibody that was FDA approved for episodic cluster headache, but not for chronic cluster headache. That means that maybe you have to design studies differently when you're doing episodic and chronic cluster headache. There are some suggestions that you may need longer treatment for chronic cluster headache, but it is very, very difficult to do a 1-year blinded study where patients don't know they're getting something for an entire year. So this study is open label, and that's kind of my theory, my personal opinion on why they might have done it that way. And again, you'll probably notice I didn't give you the name of the treatment. I can't give you the specific name here for several reasons, but mainly, in my opinion, it's because this slide is not supposed to be an advertisement for the drug. It is supposed to be seen as information about the trials. So you can go to their website or go to clinicaltrials.gov to kind of get more information on exactly what it is. So here's that same slide as before on the science behind the treatments for cluster headache. The anti-CGRP monoclonal antibodies work on the pain system in red. So what these do is that they block a molecule called CGRP, or calcitonin gene-related peptide, which is involved in pain signaling for the face. So you're just trying to block the signal. This is not the first anti-CGRP monoclonal antibody ever tried for headaches. Several of them actually have previously been FDA approved for cluster headache and or migraine. So here are some details. We're going to go through each of the studies because I want to give people with episodic cluster headache information as well as chronic cluster headache. So this is the one for episodic cluster headache, the Alleviate study. It's a phase 3 study, which is usually the last phase before trying to get FDA approval. The goal is to enroll a little bit over 300 patients. It's anticipated to go at least through the end of the year. The design of the study is kind of interesting. It says here, each patient will receive the monoclonal. So you either, you get a drug or placebo the first week or the fourth week. So you either get the drug the first week or you get the drug the fourth week. So if you go through the whole study, you have a 100% chance of getting the monoclonal antibody. You just don't know when you will get it. So it's a very interesting design. As for what the patient will have to do, or how the participant, you'll fill out a daily headache diary to document any attacks you've had. as well as several visits where they may do some additional testing like drawing blood. I'm not going to go through all the details of what they test, but again, in my personal opinion, the study design is very standard for clinical trials. The testing done is things you would normally find in a primary care doctor's office, so you'd be familiar with kind of what they're going to be doing in these studies. Here's the criteria to be in the study. So you have to be between 18 and 75. You have to have cluster headache. If you're over the age of 50, your cluster headaches had to have started before you turned age 51. You have to be obviously actively having cluster headaches. And your typical headache cycle needs to be 6 weeks or longer. If you are one of those unfortunate people that has multiple types of headaches, let's say you have cluster headache and migraine, you need to be able to tell the difference between the two headaches. A few more eligibility criteria that are important. If you have tried a different CGRP monoclonal antibody, or these new medications that end in GPAN, if you've tried one of those for your cluster headaches and it didn't work, then you probably will not be a good candidate for this study because it's a similar medication. If you have other types of extremely painful pain syndromes and they're really acting up, like fibromyalgia or complex regional pain syndrome, we have other headache types that are similar to cluster headache, or these very rare variants of migraine, you may also not be a good candidate for the study. And then finally, for safety reasons, if you have uncontrolled psychiatric disorders or dementia, if you're a significant risk of suicide, or you have severe other diseases like strokes or clots, then you may also not be a good candidate for the study. And that's again just for safety. They don't want something bad to happen to you while you're in the study, in my opinion. So here is the chronic cluster headache study. This one's a little bit different. It is not a randomized controlled trial. It is also a phase 3 study. They're enrolling less people, so about 25 patients in the United States, more in the rest of the world. And then this one, it's a 1-year study where every person who finishes the study would get CGRP monoclonal antibody for a year. Now it finishes enrollment this month. So you're going to have to check with the clinicaltrials.gov or on the company website to see if they're still enrolling, because they're only looking for 25 people. The criteria for the study are very similar to the other one. You have to be between 18 and 75 years old and have cluster headache. Again, if you're over 50, you have to have headaches that started, your cluster headaches have to start before you turn 51. And if you have multiple types of headaches, again, you should be able to tell the difference between your cluster headaches and everything else. Same thing here also. If you've tried other CGRP antibodies or the medicines ending in GPANT and they didn't work for you, you probably don't want to be in this study because it's similar. If you have other extremely painful disorders or uncontrolled psychiatric disorders or dementia or suicide or high suicide risk, or have any of these other severe diseases where something might really happen to you, then you may not also be a good candidate for the study. But those are the two studies kind of at the top here on this part. I'm going to finish here by talking about the second study, which is vitamin D, and then I'll try to answer some questions. So this is a picture that Pete Batchelor, some of you may know affectionately as Batch, kindly allowed for use in this presentation. So this study is based in a large part on his citizen science results on the effectiveness of vitamin D in patients with cluster headache. It's not exactly the same thing as his protocol. The study does not use everything listed in this image. He is not officially endorsing, or he's not a spokesman or whatever you want to call it for our study, but the study does use a lot of his data and a lot of the things that are part of the study, like the vitamin D part and the multivitamin. Again, how this seems to work. We do think that high-dose vitamin D likely works on the trigeminal pain system, similar to the triptans and ergots and capsaicin and the CGP monoclonal antibodies. And here is my last slide, just a summary of the vitamin D study. We're looking for, in this study, they're looking for patients between the ages of 18 and 70, either episodic or chronic cluster And the cycles last, if you have episodic at least, have cycles that last at least 6 weeks long. The study is for vitamin D plus a multivitamin. It's going to last 7 weeks. So in this study, there's a baseline period where you don't get any vitamin. We're just seeing how many headaches you have. There's a blinded period where you get either the vitamin D or the placebo, but you don't know which. And then there's an unblinded period where everybody gets vitamin D. And then you also get blood work done a few times. This study was designed to be COVID friendly, so everything is done virtually. For the blood work, the study team send you to a LabCorp, which is a laboratory company. They're not sponsoring the study, they're just the one place that the study's using. They have multiple labs in most medium to large cities. So you can enroll anywhere in the United States, as long as there is one of these LabCorp facilities you can get to for the blood testing. Everything else is done virtually. So that's the kind of a quick overview of what these clinical trials are, as far as how you assess them. And then for cluster headache patients, what is currently going on for you. So thank you guys for participating. Thank you for being here. And I'm Eileen. I'm happy to answer questions. Sorry for using you as a hypothetical situation.
No, it's totally cool. Thank you very much for the presentation. I actually learned a lot, actually more than I thought I was going to, especially about, I didn't know that on clinicaltrials.gov you could sort what you were looking at. Like, it's super not intuitive. So like just that little piece was super useful to me, but there was a lot in there that I really appreciated. We do have some questions, and I wanted to start by asking you, why are clinical trials almost always randomized controlled clinical trials?
Yeah, it's a good question. They're considered kind of the gold standard, but the question there is why. And the issue is, if you don't randomize them, or if you don't control for things, it doesn't give you as good of information. So if you don't randomize them, then you can have people that are putting all the healthy people, or kind of the easier to treat people in one group and the harder to treat people in the other group. And you could be doing that intentionally or unintentionally. And so you got to randomize it, and you've got to control it, because if patients go out of cycle, you don't know whether they got better because of the cycling or whether or not. And we haven't found a better way to test these things in humans. There's no blood test that will tell us, like, this is going to work in most patients, or this is not going to work in most patients. There's no robotic study or very smart AI system that can predict these things. You just have to try them.
Thank you. So as a kind of a follow-up, you mentioned citizen science in the development of the vitamin D3. How often does citizen science play a role in recommending what trials get studied?
So it's a good question. I don't think I have an exact answer. I don't think everyone's ever really studied, how many times does something that's in a case report or kind of citizen science things get turned into a study drug, an approved drug, or something that's used widely. Usually the way that drugs get to the kind of the clinical trial phase is that the researchers decide it's worth researching. And so that usually comes from patients telling you it helps, or so that'd be the citizen science part, or basic science, like an animal study that says we found the mechanism and here's something that treats this mechanism, and that's how it kind of comes through. So it's always interesting if you ever talk to your physician and you say, how does this drug work for my disease? Usually the answer is one of two things. It's either, well, there's this mechanism and it blocks this mechanism and that's involved in cluster headache, or I don't know. Patients just started trying it and it seems to help, and we designed a bunch of trials and we know how it works, but we don't even know exactly how it fits into cluster headache yet. We just know it's safe and it's effective.
That's interesting. Okay, so switching tracks, somebody asked, they're Canadian, but they live very close to Detroit, and they want to know if they're allowed to take part in clinical trials in the United States, or does their Canadian citizenship Like, can you not cross borders and participate in clinical trials?
Generally, you just talk to the study and ask them, and they would be able to tell you. I don't know. I know that we have one study just from our study that if you want to send us samples, you just have to be in the United States. It doesn't matter if you have what your citizenship is, or you just have to be physically in the United States.
Cool. All right, so somebody else has asked if I am already on vitamin D3 and my lab levels of D3 are high, can I still be in the vitamin D3 study?
So good question. So for that study, I'll have to go back and look, but you have to be off of your vitamin D regimen, obviously, to be on the vitamin D to be in the study. We would want to double your dose. But that one does not have if you've tried vitamin D before, whether it's worked or not worked, you could still be in that study, but you do have to stop your vitamin D. They do check levels. You have a level above a certain amount at the beginning of the study, you can't be in the study. It has to be kind of in the normal range. It can't be too high.
So that leads me to another question. Some people are expressing that they have fear of participating in clinical trials, especially living with cluster headache, because, what if they are in a group and they're not allowed to take their regular abortive treatments? What kind of support do studies offer? I know it varies from study to study, but especially when we're talking to cluster headache patients, that fear is very real. Like, I'm going to have to live through how many attacks just to participate in this study? What do they do about that?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. If you're testing a medicine to break your headaches, let's say you're trying to test oxygen, usually the way the studies are designed, and each one is different, but they'll say you got to try the interventional, the drug first, or the placebo. And if that doesn't work after so many minutes, usually like 15 minutes, then you can take whatever else you want. So a lot of times it's more of like, this has to be your first line, and the regular first line now is your second line. So that's how they would do like an oxygen study. For preventives, usually, and in the case with both of these studies that I listed here, you can take any medicine to break your headaches you want. That doesn't change. If you take oxygen, if you use a triptan, if you use anything else, you can still use that as much as you want. They're more concerned with other preventives. So whatever preventives you're on, you can stay on. You don't have to stop them typically, but they don't want you adding new ones during the study. Because that would affect, you're studying a preventive and you add another preventive, and which one is helping. So typically you can still break your headache. If oxygen works great for you, you can stay on the oxygen if you want to be on in this monoclonal antibody study or the vitamin D study. And Dr. Bunstein, if I say something wrong please let me know, but I think you can still stay on you use any abortive treatment you want.
You're completely right, Dr. Burish. So, and you're very familiar with this trial and the protocol, and you're keeping it right on the track.
Thanks.
And when will the results of the vitamin D trial be published, and where will they be published? Do you know the answer to that yet? And then also the other study.
So that study, I didn't put that on there. So that study is going to be the vitamin D is going to be enrolling out for probably about 2 to 3 years. So we won't have all of the data back for 2 or 3 years. For that study, they're looking to enroll a little over 200 people if you put all the episodic and cluster chronic together. So it may take some time. Where we're publishing it, don't know. We'll publish it in a journal. The journals decide whether to take the publication or not, so I don't have any control over it. But it will be published in a scientific journal. For the Lundbeck study, for the CGP monoclonal antibody study, that one's anticipated to enroll kind of finishing this year. So it would finish in January 2023. Now, it doesn't immediately get published. The data has to be analyzed. There may be things in there that lead them to design a new study and not publish that data yet, or it may lead them to publish as fast as they can so they can get FDA approval for it. So it kind of depends on what they see with the data. And again, Dr. Bench, I obviously don't work for your company, so if there's something different with how you would assess the clinical trial data, please let me know.
No, then you're completely right. But also to add to that, that sometimes looking at clinicaltrials.gov, you can see that some of the results will be shown there publicly. And also for every trial that Lundbeck does, and that's a commitment that we do, that we publish every trial. So, and that it's just a matter of time and months after trial completion that will be publicly available, most likely in medical journal.
Perfect.
Yeah, the advantage of the medical journal is you get peer reviewed. You have independent scientists look at it and say, yes, this looks like a legitimate study. We believe the results, and you have kind of independent confirmation.
Which is a really nice thing to have, I think. My power is flickering, so I made Bob a co-host just in case I go away. I apologize. We have a few more questions. Do you guys have time to answer a few more questions before we go? Great, perfect, thank you. And now I've lost my place because my power is flickering. So if you are in a place in the world where there isn't a clinical trial happening, is your only recourse to just wait for a clinical trial to become available in your area, or for the medication to be approved if it is approved? Or can you, like, is there clinical trial tourism? Can you travel? I know we kind of already answered this, but do people do this?
I personally, I have heard of people traveling. I know there's been some studies that are at a single site, and people will travel there and stay there for a week or two to be in the study. I'd imagine, I don't know how you would do this. I would imagine that if there's enough people interested in a certain place, that a study would be really interested in opening a site there. I don't know how you get everybody together to inform the study that, like, we would really all love to have a opportunity here, and we think you might be a good match for it, but I don't know how you would. But you could always contact the study team and see if there's a plan to be there, and maybe they can talk to you. But I have heard of kind of the people going somewhere. The big thing there would be, how long is the study? If you want to do the for example, the Chronicle study, which is a year long, that might be a little tough. But if you want to do something for a couple of weeks or a short period of time, that might be doable.
I would never underestimate the power of a bunch of cluster heads to get together and make this happen, though, because they are really motivated to find treatments that work. How long does a clinical trial typically take from beginning from pre-phase 1 to end of phase 3 and publishing results?
I would probably say, I mean, it's years, definitely. A decade or so might be, if you're going from animals all the way to getting it available for patients. The animal part may be the longest, because you're starting off with not knowing what you're doing, not knowing what's important, what's not important. Once you get into the phased studies, it depends on the disease. For cluster headache, it's going to be a little longer because there's not as many cluster headache patients. If you were researching diabetes, you could enroll lots of patients very quickly. So for cluster headache, a lot of the studies will go on for the final part, which is the longest trial part, would go on for something like 2 to 3 years. So I'd probably say, 5 years for the basic science, a few years for the phase 1 and phase 2, and probably 3 years for the phase 3. And then the final part, actually getting the FDA approval, sometimes can take another year or 2. It really just depends on how fast the FDA's approval process goes, if there's more trials needed, things like that. Dr. Benstein or Bob, you've probably had some experience looking through these processes over the years. If you have other things, please let me know.
I think most of it could be delaying it also is that with the interaction of the FDA, and there comes up well, we like what you're seeing, but we haven't really checked this area. Maybe we need to have some additional information on that one, and then we need to start up another trial. And just running the trial, that's about half of the time, because there's a lot of planning before, and then also some time in the end for closing it. So that is something that could delay a program like that, but that's very dependent on the interactions, and hopefully no one wants to delay this more than necessary. So we hope to make a good trial from the beginning and have it as smooth sailing as possible.
I heard somewhere that something like 80% of research projects fail ultimately. And so getting, and I don't know if this is true, so maybe you can tell me, but getting a treatment to market to the place where people can use it and it's been determined safe and effective, is a really rare thing. Is that the case?
Oh, if you look at every drug that's theorized, yes, I mean, there's a lot of points along the time where things get kind of sidetracked or don't end up not working. I would say that, if you're looking at how many get stopped for safety reasons, I don't know the answer to that. I think the 80% is probably more of like how many go through the clinical trial, the effectiveness part. But yeah, there's a lot of things that end up not working. Now, if you're I would say if you're in the phase 3, usually that means that the phase 2 data, where they get some data on effectiveness, was promising. So usually by the time you go to phase 3, they thought it was worth continuing. They have the team has some data that suggests that maybe this is going to work. So I wouldn't go into, for example, a phase 3 trial thinking that this is probably not going to work for me. I would kind of go into thinking, whoever's designing this has figured out that there's probably enough, data to support doing the full-on study, which costs a lot of money to put these things together.
But yeah, sometimes trials still fail in phase 3 and you never know. And that's why we do the phase 3 trials, right?
Right.
So you get enough data to really show. Looking to see, there are a few more questions. Unfortunately, I do apologize. Some people are asking some personal medical questions, and because we are not your doctor, we can't answer personal medical questions on this webinar. However, if you do have questions that you would like support with, that we cannot answer unless we get to know you personally and talk to you, please email us at info@clusterbusters.org. We're happy as a patient support organization to look into giving you support for your cluster headache disease. We don't want anybody to feel like we're ignoring you. It's just in the context of this webinar, we can't give personal medical advice. It just wouldn't be a good idea. But definitely, if you need support, please reach out to us. We are running over time at this point, so I do want to take the time to say thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your participation. I want to thank our panelists today, Dr. Burish, Marcus, Bob, for being here and joining us. And I want to thank Lundbeck and Dr. Burish for their amazing support of Cluster Busters as we try to support you, the cluster headache patient. I hope that you all have a great evening.